Lone Dog saved the Lion King from a hunter's trap. Next morning, the whole pride appeared at his door. The wire was buried too shallow, its coil visible through the dust like a steel serpent waiting to strike. The lion's paw hit the trigger mechanism with his full weight behind it. 300 kilograms of muscle and bone driving down onto metal teeth designed to hold buffalo. The snap echoed across the kopje like a gunshot, and the lion's roar that followed was something beyond sound. It was pain made audible, fury given voice, the kind of scream that made every creature within a kilometer freeze in recognition of suffering. He twisted, trying to pull free, but the wire only tightened, its serrated edges cutting deeper into flesh and tendon. Blood darkened the red earth. His pride scattered, their survival instinct overriding loyalty. All except the old matriarch who circled once, twice, her amber eyes meeting his before she too turned and fled into the acacia shadows. And from a shack made of corrugated metal and hope half a kilometer away, a dog with ribs like fingers and scars like a map heard that scream and knew, somehow, that it was meant for him. Wait before the next revelation happens. If this bond between these creatures has already touched you, tell us where you're watching from. To witness every act of courage, every impossible friendship, and every silent miracle of nature, subscribe and join our circle. The next moment will change everything. Now, back to the wild. Part 1. The Incident and the Proposition. The dog had no name. He had once, perhaps, in the time before he was thrown from a moving truck on a dirt road 30 kilometers from anywhere. But memory of it had faded along with memory of full bulls and gentle hands. What remained was survival, a skill he had learned through hunger and thirst and the constant calculation of risk versus reward that governed every moment of existence at the margins of civilization. He was a mixed breed, part shepherd and part something else, with a coat that had once been golden but was now the color of dust and scars that told stories he could not speak. His left ear was torn halfway down from a fight with a jackal over a scavenged bone. His right hip bore a permanent limp from being kicked by a farmer whose chickens he had been accused, correctly, of stalking. He was thin, always thin, his body a testament to the mathematics of rural poverty, where even humans struggled to eat, and dogs existed only at the sufferance of those who occasionally threw them scraps. The shack where he lived, if it could be called living, belonged to an old man named Kofi, who worked as a night watchman at a safari lodge 8 kilometers away. Kofi was gone most nights, leaving at dusk and returning at dawn, which meant the dog had the shack to himself in the darkness. It was not much. 4 walls of rusted metal, a floor of packed earth, a roof that leaked in 3 places during the rains. But it was shelter, and shelter was everything. The arrangement between man and dog was simple and unspoken. The dog did not bite. The dog barked when strangers approached. In exchange, Kofi left him water in a dented bowl and, when money allowed, bones with some meat still clinging to them. There was no affection between them. Kofi had seen too many animals die to waste emotion on creatures whose lifespans were measured in hunger and disease. But there was mutual utility, and that was enough. On this morning, Kofi had not yet returned from his night shift. The sun was climbing, turning the sky from pink to blue to white hot, and the dog lay in the narrow shadow cast by the shack, panting, conserving energy. His water bowl was empty. It had been empty since yesterday. Kofi usually refilled it when he returned, but sometimes he forgot, or sometimes he stopped at the village bar and drank his wages and came home with nothing. The dog was used to thirst, was used to hunger, was used to waiting. Then the roar came. It cut through the morning stillness like a knife through skin, a sound of such raw agony that every muscle in the dog's body tensed. He lifted his head, ears swiveling toward the sound. It came from the direction of the kopje, the rocky outcrop that rose from the savanna like a broken tooth about 500 meters from the shack. The dog knew that kopje. He had explored it during his wanderings, had marked its boundaries, had learned which crevices held shade and which held snakes. He also knew the lions that sometimes used it as a lookout point, had seen them from a distance, moving through the grass like tawny shadows, their presence a constant reminder that he was small and vulnerable and existed only because they chose to ignore him. He avoided them as any sensible dog would, avoided their scent trails, their kills, their territories. But this sound was different from the casual roars he had heard before, the territorial announcements, the mating calls, the warnings issued to competitors. This was the sound of a creature in mortal danger, and something in it bypassed his fear and spoke directly to a deeper instinct, one that had been bred into dogs over thousands of years of partnership with humans. The instinct to investigate distress, to respond to crisis, to help. The dog stood, his body trembling, whether from fear or anticipation or simply weakness from hunger, he could not have said. He took one step toward the kopje, stopped, took another step. His rational mind, such as it was, screamed at him to stay in the shade, to conserve energy, to ignore whatever drama was unfolding in the wild. But his legs kept moving, carrying him across the packed earth of the clearing, through the gap in the thorn fence that surrounded the shack, and out onto the savanna. The grass was dry and waist-high, brown with drought, and it scratched at his belly as he moved. The sun hammered down, and within minutes his tongue was lolling, his breathing labored. But the roaring continued, growing louder as he approached, interspersed now with sounds of thrashing and deep, rumbling growls of frustration. The dog slowed as he neared the kopje, his body crouching low in the grass, his instincts taking over. Whatever was ahead might be dangerous, might be an opportunity. He needed to see before being seen. He crept to the base of the rocks and peered around a boulder. The lion was magnificent even in his agony. His mane was full and dark, indicating his prime years, and his body bore the scars of territorial battles won and rivals driven away. He was the kind of lion that safari guides pointed out with reverence, a king, a patriarch, a genetic jackpot of size and strength and aggression. But now he was trapped, his right front paw caught in a wire snare that had been staked deep into a crevice between rocks. The trap was illegal, of course. Poaching had been banned in the conservation for years, but enforcement was sporadic and poachers were resourceful. They set snares along game trails in places where animals would step without thinking, and they checked them weekly or monthly or whenever they remembered, retrieving whatever had died in the interim: buffalo, kudu, warthog, or, sometimes, like today, something far more valuable and dangerous. The lion had been there for hours, judging by the amount of blood on the rocks and the depth of the furrows his claws had carved in the earth. He had fought the trap with all his considerable strength, but wire snares were designed to tighten with struggle. The more he pulled, the deeper it cut. His paw was mangled, the bone possibly broken, the flesh torn and swollen. He saw the dog immediately. His golden eyes locked onto the small canine figure at the base of the rocks, and his lip curled back in a snarl that exposed fangs the length of a man's fingers. The snarl was reflexive, a warning that translated clearly across species. "Come closer, and I will kill you, trap or no trap." The dog froze. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and this apex predator. But something held him there. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps the recognition that the lion was helpless and therefore less dangerous than he appeared, or perhaps something else entirely, something that could not be named in the simple vocabulary of fear and hunger that usually governed his decisions. He sat down, 20 meters from the lion, close enough to see clearly, far enough to escape if the lion somehow broke free. The lion roared again, shaking his head, his mane rippling with the motion. Then he resumed fighting the trap, pulling with his trapped leg, bracing with the others, his claws gouging new furrows in the earth. It was futile, but he did not know how to surrender. Lions did not surrender. They fought until they won or until they died. The dog watched this struggle for 10 minutes, his head cocked to one side, his expression, if dogs could be said to have expressions, thoughtful. Then he stood and began to walk in a wide circle around the lion, staying at the edge of what he judged to be attacking distance, examining the situation from different angles. The lion tracked him with his eyes, snarling whenever the dog moved closer, but he was beginning to tire. Blood loss and shock were taking their toll. His movements were becoming slower, less coordinated. His breathing was labored. The dog could see this, could smell the blood and the fear scent that even apex predators produce when trapped and helpless. When the dog completed his circle and returned to his original position, he had made a decision. He did not understand why he had made it, did not possess the cognitive framework to articulate motivation, but he knew what he needed to do. He needed to free the lion. The logic was insane by any measure. The lion would likely attack him the moment it was free. Even if it did not, there was no reward waiting, no grateful gesture, no benefit to be gained. This was not like barking to warn Kofi of strangers, where the exchange of service for scraps was clear and established. This was risking his life for a creature that might eat him. But the dog had spent enough time around the safari lodge to observe something about tourists and their guides, about the way humans responded to animals in distress. He had seen them stop vehicles to help a turtle cross a road, had seen them cry over injured birds, had learned that some impulses transcend calculation, that some actions were taken not because they made sense, but because not taking them felt wrong. He began to move closer to the lion. The lion's snarl intensified, his claws extending, his entire body coiling to spring. But the chain of the snare kept him tethered, limited his range. The dog moved carefully, precisely, staying just outside that range, edging toward the point where the wire disappeared into the rocks. Up close, the trap's mechanism was visible. A steel cable looped through a spring-loaded mechanism, anchored to a stake driven deep into a crevice. The loop had tightened around the lion's paw above the wrist, and the serrated edges had bitten into flesh. Blood made the wire slick, and the lion's struggles had twisted the cable, making the coils tighter and more complex. The dog sniffed at the mechanism, his nose close enough to the lion's trapped paw that he could feel the heat radiating from the swollen flesh. The lion roared directly in his face, a blast of hot breath and sound that made the dog flinch backward. But the dog did not flee. He returned, more cautiously, and examined the cable where it attached to the stake. It was buried, but not deeply. The poacher had prioritized speed over security, digging just enough to anchor the stake in loose soil packed between rocks. The dog began to dig. His paws were not designed for excavation like a badger's or a mole's, but desperation made him resourceful. He scraped at the loose dirt, his claws clicking against stones, his nose pushing aside debris. The lion watched this activity with what might have been confusion, his snarls fading to low growls, his eyes narrowing as if trying to understand what this strange, scarred dog was attempting. It took an hour. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became brutal. The dog's mouth was dry as dust, his tongue swollen with thirst, but he kept digging. Slowly, the stake began to loosen. The soil around it grew more and more disturbed, until finally, with one hard pull of the cable during the lion's next struggle, the stake pulled free. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The cable went slack, and the lion, no longer anchored, lunged forward with all his remaining strength. His jaws snapped shut inches from the dog's head, his claws extended, his entire body a weapon aimed at the small canine who had been, moments before, his unlikely savior. The dog bolted. He ran in a zigzag pattern, instinct guiding him, making himself a difficult target. Behind him, the lion gave chase, 3 strides, 4, but the trap still hung from his paw, and the pain and blood loss made coordination impossible. He stumbled, collapsed onto his side, breathing in great heaving gasps. The dog stopped 30 meters away, his own sides heaving, and looked back. The lion was trying to stand, failing, trying again. The wire was still wrapped around his paw, still cutting into flesh, but at least he was no longer anchored. He could move, could seek shade, could potentially reach water if he could walk. The dog watched for another moment, then turned and began the long walk back to the shack. He did not look back again. He had done what he came to do, for reasons he did not understand, and now he needed to find water before his body gave out entirely. By the time he reached the shack, Kofi had returned. The old man was sleeping inside, having worked through the night, and had filled the dog's water bowl before collapsing onto his mat. The dog drank gratefully, the water cool and life-giving, then collapsed in the shade outside and slept the sleep of utter exhaustion. He did not dream. Dogs dream of chases and meals and remembered joys, but he was too tired for dreams. He simply fell into darkness and stayed there, until the sun began to set and the evening brought a slight cooling of the air. When he woke, the lion was gone from the kopje. He knew this without checking, could feel the absence in the way the birds were calling again, the way the tension had left the air. The lion had either limped away to find his pride, or had died somewhere in the rocks. Either way, the matter was finished. Or so the dog thought. He did not know that in the wild, debts are remembered. Did not know that some animals possess memories sophisticated enough to track individuals, to recognize aid received and harm inflicted. Did not know that the lion, dragging himself through the grass with the wire still wrapped around his mangled paw, had marked the dog's scent, had watched him walk away, and had understood, in the way that wild things understand without words, that this small, scarred creature had saved his life. The dog slept through the night, unaware that in the acacia forest, 6 kilometers away, a pride of lions was making decisions about loyalty, gratitude, and debts owed. Part 2. The Labyrinth of Instinct. The morning came with a sound that should not have existed, a sound so out of place that it pulled the dog from sleep before his mind fully registered what he was hearing. Low rumbling, multiple voices, the deep, chest-vibrating sound that lions made when communicating with each other over short distances. The dog's eyes snapped open, his body instantly alert, adrenaline flooding his system. He was on his feet before conscious thought engaged, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sounds were close, too close, coming from multiple directions. He emerged from behind the shack and froze. The pride was there. 7 lions, 3 lionesses, 2 adolescent males, 1 elderly female, and him, the male with the mangled paw wrapped in dried blood and mud. The trap wire finally gone, but the damage permanent. They were arranged in a loose semicircle around the front of the shack, not in attack formation, but in something else, something the dog had no framework to understand. The morning light caught their coats, turning them to burnished gold, and their eyes, all 14 of them, were fixed on the dog with an intensity that turned his legs to water. He could run, should run, but his body would not obey, frozen in the grip of fear so primal it bypassed conscious control. Kofi's door opened. The old man stepped out, yawning, scratching his chest, then stopped mid-motion as his sleep-fogged brain registered what was in his front yard. His hand moved slowly toward the long stick he kept by the door, not a weapon really, but something to wave and shout with, something that sometimes made wild animals think twice. "Usiende," Kofi whispered, "don't move," though whether he was speaking to the dog or to himself was unclear. The male lion with the injured paw took one step forward. The movement was awkward, his right front leg barely touching the ground, but his eyes never left the dog. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. Close enough now that the dog could see the individual whiskers on his muzzle, could smell the scent of meat and blood and wild places. The lion stopped 2 meters away. His tail swished once. Then he lowered his massive head until it was level with the dog's, their eyes meeting at equal height. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, predator and prey, apex and scavenger, wild and domesticated. Then the lion did something that made Kofi gasp and the dog's ears flatten in confused submission. He extended his injured paw forward, slowly, deliberately, and placed it on the ground in front of the dog. The gesture was clear, unmistakable, universal. "Look, remember, this is what you saved." The dog's tail, which had been tucked tight against his belly, began to wag. Just a small movement, uncertain, but a wag nonetheless. The lion held the position for 3 seconds more, then withdrew his paw and turned. He limped back to the pride, and the lionesses closed ranks around him, their rumbles now carrying a different tone, approval perhaps, or satisfaction at a duty fulfilled. Then, as smoothly as they had appeared, the pride melted back into the savannah. Within minutes, they had vanished into the morning haze, leaving behind only paw prints in the dust and the overwhelming scent of lion that would linger for hours. Kofi stood frozen, his stick forgotten in his hand. Then he looked down at the dog, who was still standing exactly where the lion had left him, still staring at the empty space where the pride had been. "Weiwei," Kofi said softly, "you, Unaninini? What are you?" The question was rhetorical, but it captured the impossibility of what had just happened. Lions did not visit dogs, did not offer what appeared to be gratitude or acknowledgement, did not arrange themselves peacefully in front of human dwellings. The natural order had been violated, or perhaps revealed to be more complex than simple predation and fear. Kofi walked slowly to where the male lion had stood and knelt, examining the paw prints. Large, the largest he had ever seen, with visible gaps where claws had pressed deep into the earth. And there, clear as a photograph, was the asymmetry of the right print, the way it pressed lighter, the blood that had seeped into the dust, the evidence of injury. "You helped him," Kofi said, looking back at the dog. It was not a question. "Yesterday, that roaring, you went to the kopje." The dog's tail wagged again, more confidently now. Kofi shook his head slowly, a smile creasing his weathered face. "Mjinga," he said, "fool, but without heat. Brave fool." He went back into the shack and emerged with 2 things, a bowl of water and a piece of dried meat. Real meat, not gristle, not bone, but actual flesh saved from his own meager supplies. He placed both in front of the dog. "Asante," he said, "thank you, for showing an old man that the world still has mysteries." The dog ate and drank, and for the first time in his life, the transaction felt like more than survival. It felt like recognition. But the story, improbable as it already was, had barely begun. The pride's visit was not an end, but a beginning. The opening of a door into a relationship that would reshape the dog's understanding of his place in the world. 3 days later, the pride returned. This time they came at dusk, emerging from the thorn scrub as the sun painted the sky orange and red. The same 7 lions, moving in formation, with the injured male at the center. But this time they were not empty-handed or empty-jawed. The lead lioness carried something in her mouth, a young impala, freshly killed, its neck broken cleanly. She walked directly to the clearing in front of the shack and dropped the carcass 10 meters from where the dog lay in his usual spot, watching their approach with a mixture of awe and terror. The lioness stepped back. The male rumbled, a sound that seemed to mean proceed, and the dog, after a long moment of hesitation, approached the kill. It was more meat than he had seen in months, more meat than he could possibly eat in one sitting. The scent of it made his mouth flood with saliva, made his empty stomach clench with anticipation. He looked from the carcass to the lions, then back to the carcass, trying to understand the transaction. Was it a gift or a test? Would they attack if he accepted? The male lion lay down, his injured paw stretched out in front of him, and simply watched. The rest of the pride followed his lead, settling into relaxed positions that communicated clearly. Eat, this is yours. The dog ate. He tore into the impala with desperate efficiency, filling his belly for the first time in his life with choice meat, not scraps or stolen bones, but food earned through action, through courage, through the impossible debt that the lion had chosen to repay. Kofi watched from his doorway, his mind reeling. He was a practical man, not given to superstition, but what he was witnessing had no practical explanation. Lions did not hunt for dogs, did not share kills. The natural order was predator and prey, and dogs, especially lone homeless dogs, existed as potential prey, nothing more. Yet here they were, a pride of lions delivering food to a scarred mutt, waiting patiently while he ate, showing no aggression or possessiveness over the kill. When the dog had eaten his fill, perhaps a quarter of the carcass, he stepped back, his belly distended, his muzzle bloody. The lions made no move toward the remaining meat. Instead, the male stood, limped to the carcass, and used his good paw to drag it closer to the shack, placing it in the shade where it would last longer, where the dog could return to it. Then, as before, the pride withdrew into the dusk, leaving behind meat and paw prints and a reality that neither man nor dog could fully comprehend. "They will come back," Kofi said quietly. "This is not finished." He was correct. The pride returned twice more that week, always at dusk or dawn, always with food. Not every time. Sometimes they simply appeared, settled near the shack, and rested for an hour before departing. But their presence became a constant, a reassurance, a guard that kept other predators at bay and transformed the shack from a lonely outpost into the safest spot in the conservancy. Word began to spread. Other night watchmen heard the story. Safari guides noticed the pride's unusual behavior and tracked them to Kofi's shack. Within 2 weeks, tourists were being brought to see the Dog King, the homeless mutt who had somehow befriended a pride of lions, who sat unafraid among them, who ate from their kills. The attention made Kofi uncomfortable. He was a private man, and the sudden influx of vehicles and cameras disturbed his simple life. But it also brought opportunity. The safari lodge that employed him took notice, saw the potential for a unique attraction, and offered him a better position, guardian of the observation point, where tourists could park at a safe distance and watch the improbable relationship between dog and lions. The pay was better, the responsibilities lighter. For the first time in years, Kofi had enough money to eat properly, to buy medicine when needed, to save small amounts against future emergencies. And the dog, for his part, was no longer starving, no longer constantly calculating survival. The pride's regular visits meant regular food, and their presence meant protection from hyenas, from jackals, from the casual cruelty that rural dogs usually endured. But there was a cost to this new arrangement, one that neither Kofi nor the dog fully anticipated. The dog was becoming wild again. Not feral, he still returned to the shack, still accepted water from Kofi, still performed his function of barking at strangers. But he spent increasing amounts of time away from the shack, following the pride on their hunts, watching from a safe distance as they brought down zebra and wildebeest, learning their patterns and their territories. He was learning to be a lion, or at least to think like one, was learning to read the land the way they read it, to interpret scent and sound and the behavior of prey animals, was learning that the world was larger than the small circuit between shack and village and safari lodge, that there were horizons beyond the ones he had known. The lionesses tolerated his presence with varying degrees of patience. The adolescent males occasionally tried to chase him, but the injured male would intervene with a warning growl, and the chase would stop. The old female seemed almost fond of him, sometimes allowing him to lie near her in the shade, her tail flicking lazy flies from both their faces. It was the injured male, though, who remained the dog's primary connection to the pride. His paw was healing slowly, badly, the bones knitting crookedly and the scar tissue thick and inflexible. He would never hunt the way he had before, would never be able to deliver the explosive bursts of speed that made lions successful killers. But he could still lead, could still make decisions, could still command the respect of his pride through personality and memory rather than pure physical dominance. And he had chosen to extend his protection to this dog who had saved him, had made that choice deliberately, had communicated it to his pride, had enforced it when challenged. In doing so, he had created something unprecedented, a permanent treaty between predator and scavenger, a relationship that existed outside the normal rules of the wild. But the wild has its own rules about what is sustainable and what is not. And the pride's unusual behavior had not gone unnoticed by other forces in the ecosystem, forces less benevolent than lions who remembered deaths. Part 3. The territory wars began 3 weeks after the pride's first visit to the shack. They came not from other predators, but from humans. Specifically, from the poachers who had set the trap that nearly killed the male lion, and who had returned to check their snares only to find them triggered and empty, their profit disappeared. Poachers in this region were not casual opportunists, but organized operators who viewed the Conservancy as their hunting ground, and any interference with their operations as a direct challenge. The wire snares were expensive, the stakes carefully placed in high-traffic game trails, and the loss of even one trap represented lost revenue. When they discovered the sprung trap at the kopje and followed the lion's blood trail back towards Kofi's shack, they made assumptions. Correct assumptions. Someone had interfered with their work, and interference could not be tolerated. They came at midday, when the sun was at its peak and most creatures were resting, when the heat made thinking difficult and resistance seem futile. 3 men in a rusted pickup truck, armed with machetes and a single old rifle that probably dated from colonial times but was still perfectly capable of killing. Kofi was at the safari lodge, working his shift. The dog was alone at the shack, lying in the narrow shadow cast by the corrugated metal wall, too hot to move, too tired to care. He registered the truck's engine as it approached, a sound that had become common with the tourist traffic, and did not raise his head until the vehicle stopped directly in front of the shack and 3 men climbed out. The dog's hackles rose immediately. These were not tourists with cameras and soft voices. These were men who smelled of sweat and violence and purpose, whose body language radiated aggression even before they spoke. The leader, a tall man with a scar that bisected his right cheek, looked around the clearing, taking in the empty shack, the water bowl, the dog rising slowly to his feet with teeth bared. He said something in Swahili too fast for the dog to parse, even if he could have understood human speech, but the tone was clear, contempt and anger. One of the other men pointed at the dog and laughed, a mean sound that made the dog's ears flatten. Then the scarred man kicked the water bowl, sending it spinning across the clearing, and began walking toward the shack. The dog barked. It was a deep, warning bark that carried more confidence than he felt, a sound designed to make threats reconsider, to announce that this space was protected. The man ignored him, reaching the door and pulling it open, stepping inside to search for whatever he thought he would find. The other 2 men began to circle, one heading toward the back of the shack, one staying near the truck. The dog was outnumbered, outmatched, and under normal circumstances would have fled. But this was his territory now, had become his territory through the strange alchemy of time and routine and the meals he had eaten here, the water he had drunk. He growled, low and continuous, backing toward the shack's entrance, positioning himself between the men and Kophas's meager possessions. The man near the truck laughed again and picked up a rock, weighing it in his hand, clearly considering whether it was worth the effort to throw at a hostile dog. Then the afternoon air shifted. The birds stopped calling, the insects went silent, and a sound rumbled across the savannah that made all 3 men freeze, a sound that every human who lives near wild places learns to recognize and fear. The roar of an approaching lion. Not one lion, several. The pride burst from the thorn scrub like a tawny wave, moving at a pace that made the ground shake, led by the injured male who ran despite his mangled paw, his lips pulled back to expose his canines, his roar continuous and filled with fury. The lionesses flanked him, the adolescent males behind. The whole pride moving in coordinated purpose toward the 3 men who had made the critical mistake of threatening the dog in their presence. The men ran, scrambled for the truck in blind panic, the scarred leader abandoning whatever he was doing in the shack and diving through the window because the door was too far. The engine roared to life. Miracle of miracles, it started on the first try. And the truck lurched forward, tire spinning in the loose dirt, fishtailing as the driver floored the accelerator. The pride gave chase for 50 meters, then stopped as one, watching the truck disappear down the dirt road in a cloud of dust and terror. The male lion roared once more, a sound of victory, of warning, then turned back to where the dog stood trembling in the clearing. The dog's tail began to wag, tentative at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. He approached the male lion and did something he had never done before. He touched his nose to the lion's nose, a gesture of greeting, of gratitude, of recognition that they were, in some impossible way, pack. The male lion rumbled, a sound entirely different from his roar, low and almost gentle. He licked the dog's face once, his rough tongue scraping away dust and fear scent, then turned and walked to the overturned water bowl. He sniffed at it, then looked back at the dog as if to say, "This needs fixing." One of the lionesses walked to the shack and peered inside, checking for remaining threats. Finding none, she emerged and settled in the clearing, claiming the best shade. The rest of the pride joined her, arranging themselves in a defensive perimeter around the shack, around the dog, making it clear to anything watching that this place was under their protection. When Kofi returned at dusk and saw the pride arrayed around his home, he knew immediately that something had happened. The dog's agitated energy, the disturbed earth, the overturned bowl, all told a story that the old man had no trouble interpreting. He set the bowl upright, filled it from his precious water supply, and bowed slightly to the male lion. "Asante," he said, "thank you, again for protecting what is mine." The lion's tail flicked in acknowledgement. Then the pride rose as one and melted back into the savanna, leaving Kofi and the dog alone in the deepening darkness. But the encounter with the poachers had changed something fundamental. The pride's protection was no longer just about repaying a debt. It had become active, ongoing, personal. They returned every day now, sometimes twice a day, checking on the shack, ensuring the dog's safety. Their territory, which previously had encompassed several dozen square kilometers, now seemed to center on this patch of dirt and corrugated metal where a scarred dog lived. The poachers did not return, but word of their encounter spread. Soon everyone in the region knew. The dog at Kofi's shack was protected by lions, and anyone who threatened him did so at mortal risk. It was a fact that defied natural law, but could not be denied, not when there were witnesses, not when the proof walked on four paws and brought meat to a mutt who should have been prey. Tourists came in increasing numbers. The Safari Lodge raised its rates. Kofi received a raise and a new shack. Real walls, a proper roof, a door that locked. The dog, for his part, grew fat and sleek, his ribs no longer visible, his coat shining with health. It seemed like a perfect arrangement, a fairy tale made real. But the wild does not allow fairy tales to persist unchanged. It tests them, fractures them, forces them to evolve or dissolve. The test came from an unexpected direction, from within the pride itself. The injured male's condition was deteriorating. The poorly healed paw had developed chronic infection, the kind that antibiotics might have cured, but that, in the wild, became a slow death sentence. He was eating less, moving with increasing difficulty, spending more time lying in the shade while the lionesses did the hunting. His breath had taken on the sweet rot smell of internal decay, and his eyes, though still fierce when focused on the dog, had begun to cloud with pain and exhaustion. The pride knew what was coming. Animals understand death in ways humans often deny, as a natural conclusion, an ending that does not require tragedy or drama. But understanding did not make it simple. The male's position as leader was being challenged by the younger males, whose patience with his weakness was wearing thin. And if leadership changed, if a new male took over, the arrangement with the dog might not survive. New leaders rewrite the rules. They kill the cubs of their predecessors to bring females back into breeding condition faster. They mark new boundaries, claim new territories, establish new hierarchies. A debt owed by the previous leader becomes irrelevant, a strange quirk to be ended rather than honored. The fracture, when it came, happened at dawn on a day when the sky was perfectly clear and the air carried the sweet scent of rain still days away. The injured male had not returned to the pride the night before. The lionesses had searched for him, calling out with low rumbles that carried across kilometers, but received no response. The dog found him. He was lying in a gully half a kilometer from the shack, his breathing shallow and rapid, his sides barely moving. The infection had reached his blood, was shutting down his organs one by one, and there was nothing to be done. No vet, no medicine, no intervention that could reach him in time, or matter if it did. The dog sat beside him, as close as he dared, and whined softly. The lion's eyes opened, took a moment to focus, then found the dog and held. Recognition flickered in those amber depths, along with something that might have been satisfaction, or simply relief that he would not die alone. The lion made a sound, half rumble and half sigh that seemed to carry meaning. "You did well. You saved me once. That was enough." Then his breathing slowed further, stopped. The dog stayed beside the body until the sun was high, until he heard the approach of the pride, drawn by his continued whining. The lionesses arrived first, circling the body, touching the male with their muzzles, rumbling their grief. The adolescent males hung back, uncertain, already calculating hierarchy in the way young males must. The eldest of the adolescent males, a large, scarred youth who had been challenging the injured male's authority for weeks, approached the dog with his head lowered and his tail lashing. His intention was clear. The arrangement dies with its architect. You are no longer protected. The dog understood. He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving the young male, his body low and submissive. He could run, might survive, but the young lion was faster, stronger, and motivated by the need to establish dominance. The young male crouched, ready to spring. Then the old lioness, the one who had sometimes let the dog lie near her, she was long past her breeding years, held no official rank in the pride, but she was ancient by lion standards, and age carried authority. She faced the young male and growled, not a playful sound, but a warning that carried the weight of years and battles and survival. The young male hesitated. The other lionesses were watching, waiting to see how he would respond to this challenge. If he backed down, he would appear weak. If he pressed forward, he would have to fight the old female, and while he would likely win, the victory would cost him in ways that mattered: respect, energy, injury. He made his choice. He stepped back, his tail still lashing, but his body language shifting from attack to retreat. The old lioness held her ground until he had moved a full 10 meters away, then turned to the dog and rumbled softly. "Go. You are no longer safe here. The debt is paid, the protector is dead, and what follows is lion business." The dog understood. He touched his nose to the old lioness's jaw, gratitude, farewell, then turned and ran. Not back to the shack, but away, into the open savanna, following instincts he had almost forgotten, seeking safety in distance and speed rather than in alliances that couldn't hold. Behind him, the pride began the process of mourning and reorganization, of accepting death and moving forward, as all wild creatures must. The dog did not look back. Part 4. The Return and the Trial. 3 weeks passed. The dog survived on the edges, reverting to the skills that had kept him alive before the lions: scavenging, stealing, avoiding. He ranged far from the shack, knowing that returning would mean confronting the new order, possibly facing the young male who had nearly killed him. Better to be alone and alive than protected and dead. He grew thin again. His coat lost its sheen. The limp in his hip worsened without regular rest and regular food. He was becoming what he had been before, a creature of margins and desperation, defined by hunger. But he could not forget, could not stop thinking, in whatever way dogs think, about the shack and Kofi and the pride that had made him, briefly, something more than a street dog waiting to die. He began to circle back, drawing closer each day, testing the boundaries. He would climb to high points and watch the shack from a distance, seeing Kofi come and go, seeing tourists arrive and leave disappointed. The dog was gone. The attraction had fled. He saw the pride, too, occasionally, moving through their territory. The young male now fully in command, leading hunts, marking boundaries, asserting his authority. The young male had killed the adolescent males who might challenge him and driven them away, had claimed the lionesses as his own, had erased as much as possible the traces of his predecessor's reign. The pride was his now, and under his leadership they followed the old rules. The rules that had governed prides for millennia before a scarred dog and an injured lion had briefly rewritten them. On the 21st day of his exile, the dog made a decision. He would return to the shack, would accept whatever consequences came. He could not continue this half-life of wandering and hiding, could not sustain the constant fear and hunger. Better to die at home, if the shack could be called home, than to slowly starve in the bushveld. He approached at dusk, moving slowly, his body language submissive, his ears back and his tail tucked. He expected to be challenged immediately, expected the young male to appear and finish what he had started at the gully. Instead, he found Kofi sitting outside the shack, older and thinner than the dog remembered, staring at the sunset with eyes that had seen too much loss. The old man's face transformed when he saw the dog. He stood, his movements stiff with age and emotion, and opened his arms. "Rafiki," he said, "friend," using a name for the first time, bestowing identity where before there had been only function. "You came back." The dog, Rafiki, approached slowly and pressed his head against Kofi's leg. The old man's hand, rough and scarred from years of labor, rested on his head, trembling slightly. "They told me you were dead," Kofi said quietly. "The tourists stopped coming. The lodge stopped paying me extra. I am just a watchman again." But I did not believe them. "You are too stubborn to die." Rafiki's tail wagged, just slightly, just enough. They went inside the shack together, and Kofi produced food, real food, saved from his own portions, and fresh water. Rafiki ate and drank, and then collapsed on the floor, exhausted, finally able to rest without one eye open for threats. But the sense of safety was an illusion. Shortly after full dark, a sound rose from the savannah that made both man and dog freeze. The roar of the young male, close and getting closer. He had scented Rafiki's return, had come to finish the interrupted hunt, to remove the last symbol of his predecessor's strange reign. Kofi grabbed his stick, useless against a lion, but it was all he had, and stood in front of the door, his old body shaking, but his resolve firm. "You want him. You go through me," Kofi said to the darkness, to the approaching roar, to the injustice of a world where loyalty was rewarded with death. The young male appeared at the edge of the clearing, his eyes reflecting the lamplight from inside the shack, his body coiled to spring. Behind him, the rest of the pride began to emerge, lionesses and adolescents, drawn by their leader's call, ready to support his decision. Rafiki moved to Kofi's side, placing himself between the old man and the lion, accepting his role as protector, even though he weighed perhaps 20 kilograms, and the lion weighed 200. It was an absurd gesture, a doomed gesture, but it was also noble in its futility, the gesture of a creature who had learned that some things were worth dying for. The young male roared, a sound of dominance and finality, and prepared to charge. Then, the old lioness stepped out of the darkness behind him. She had stayed with the pride despite her age, despite being long past breeding, because pride sometimes allowed elderly females to remain if they contributed in other ways, as babysitters, as teachers, as living memory of the pride's history. She was tolerated but not valued, included but not essential. Until this moment when she chose to use the little authority age gave her. She roared. It was not as loud as the young male's roar, not as physically imposing, but it carried different weight. It was the roar of an animal who remembered the injured male, who had watched the dog save him, who had observed the bond that developed and recognized it as something unprecedented and valuable. She was challenging the young male not for leadership, she could never win that battle, but for the right to preserve this one exception to the rules. The young male turned to face her, confusion and anger warring in his expression. This was not how hierarchies worked. Elderly females did not challenge leaders, did not intercede in hunts or decisions about territory. She was violating the social order as surely as the injured male had violated it by protecting a dog. But she did not back down. She stood between the young male and the shack, between tradition and innovation, between the old rules and the possibility that sometimes rules could be rewritten. The other lionesses watched this confrontation with visible uncertainty. They respected the old female, but they also needed the young male's protection and leadership. If they supported her, he might drive them from the pride. If they supported him, they would lose connection to their history, to the strange and wonderful time when a dog had lived among them as family. The standoff lasted 3 long minutes, an eternity in the charged atmosphere of potential violence. Then one of the lionesses, the one who had first brought the impala to Rafiki, who had started the pattern of feeding him, walked forward and stood beside the old female. Then another lioness joined them, then another. The young male watched his pride fracture, watched his authority challenged not by rivals, but by the females who were supposed to accept his leadership without question. His tail lashed, his muscles coiled, and for a moment it seemed he would attack regardless of the cost. Then one of the adolescent males, the one who had not challenged him for leadership, who had accepted subordinate status, walked past him and sat down facing the shack, making his position clear. He would not participate in this hunt. The young male was alone, not literally. He still had power, still commanded respect, but he was alone in his conviction that the dog must die. The pride had chosen differently, had voted with their placement and their presence for the preservation of something strange and unprecedented. The young male roared one more time, frustration, anger, wounded pride, then turned and stalked back into the darkness. The rest of the pride remained, arranged in a protective semicircle around the shack, making their decision clear. Kofi slowly lowered his stick, his hands shaking with released adrenaline. Rafiki's tail began to wag, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence as he realized what had just happened. He had been protected again, but this time not by a single lion remembering a debt, but by an entire pride choosing to honor the memory of that debt even after the debtor had died. The old lioness approached the shack and lay down directly in front of the door, positioning herself as a physical barrier between Rafiki and any future threats. The other lionesses settled around her, creating layers of protection. The adolescent male who had defied his leader took up position at the clearing's edge, facing outward, watching for danger. They stayed through the night. When dawn came and the young male had not returned, had chosen, perhaps, to hunt alone rather than confront his pride's rebellion, the lionesses finally rose and began to move away. But the old female remained, looking back at the shack, at the dog standing in the doorway, at Kofi watching from the window. She rumbled once, a sound that carried farewell and promise, then followed her pride into the sunrise. Rafiki stood in the doorway long after they had disappeared, his mind processing what had occurred. He had been saved twice now, once by an individual's gratitude, once by a community's choice. The second salvation was more profound than the first because it suggested something revolutionary, that the bonds formed between species could transcend the individuals who formed them, could become part of a group's identity and memory. He had become, in some inexplicable way, part of the pride's story, not as a lion, not as prey, but as something else, a symbol, perhaps, of the idea that the rules governing predator and prey were not as rigid as they seemed, that exceptions could be made and sustained, that compassion could exist along hunger. Kofi came outside and sat beside Rafiki, both of them watching the savannah slowly wake to morning. "They will come back," the old man said. "Not every day, perhaps, but when you need them, they will come. And when they need you—" He paused, considering. "Can a dog repay a pride of lions?" Rafiki's tail wagged. He did not know the answer, but he sensed that he would have the opportunity to discover it. The bond, forged in a moment of crisis and sustained through loss and challenge, had proven durable enough to survive its architect's death. What came next was unwritten, a story still being told. They went inside together as the sun climbed higher and the day's heat began to build. In the distance, a lion roared. The young male, perhaps, asserting his authority over territory he still controlled, even if his pride had limits to their obedience. And closer, from the acacia shadows, came an answering rumble, the old lioness, responding, marking boundaries, establishing that this small patch of earth remained under different rules. The trial had been passed. The bond had been tested and had held. What remained was to see how this unprecedented arrangement would evolve, how long it could last, and what it meant for the future of both dog and pride. Part 5. The Resolution and Renewal. The months that followed brought a rhythm that felt less like exception and more like new normal. The pride's relationship with Rafiki became integrated into their routine, not replacing their wild behaviors, but supplementing them, adding a layer of complexity to their social structure that fascinated the biologists who eventually came to study them. The young male, for his part, had accepted the situation with what might have been grace or might have been pragmatic calculation. He never approached the shack again, never threatened Rafiki directly. But he also never joined the visits that the lionesses made. He maintained his leadership, fathered cubs with the lionesses, and expanded the pride's territory in other directions, away from the shack, into areas where his authority was unquestioned. It was a compromise of sorts. The pride was divided not in loyalty but in practice. The young male hunted and led in the traditional territories, and the lionesses maintained their connection to Rafiki and the shack, the two spheres of influence overlapping but distinct. The old lioness became Rafiki's primary connection to the pride. She visited almost daily, sometimes alone, sometimes with one or two of the younger lionesses and their cubs. She would rest in the shade of the shack, tolerating Rafiki's presence with what appeared to be genuine affection, occasionally grooming him with her rough tongue until his fur stood up in ridiculous tufts that made Kofi laugh. The cubs, in particular, were fascinated by Rafiki. They had no fear of him, having been exposed to his scent and presence from birth, and they would tumble around him, batting at his tail, trying to provoke play. Rafiki obliged carefully, aware that even cub claws could cause serious injury, playing a gentle version of chase and tackle that satisfied their instincts without triggering genuine aggression. Kofi watched these interactions with wonder that never quite faded. He had lived 73 years, had seen many things, but this impossible family of lions and dog remained the most extraordinary. He began to document it, writing down observations in a notebook provided by the biologists, noting behaviors and interactions, creating a record that would eventually contribute to scientific papers about interspecies bonds and the plasticity of social behavior in large predators. The tourists returned, drawn by word of the dog who lived among lions. But the dynamic had changed. The lodge, under pressure from conservationists, limited access to the site, allowing only small groups, only at certain times, only with guides who understood the delicacy of what was being observed. The income from these controlled visits allowed Kofi to retire from night watchman duties entirely, to focus on caring for the observation point and for Rafiki. For the first time in his long life, Kofi was not poor. He could buy food without calculating the cost against other needs, could afford medicine for the arthritis in his hands, could even occasionally purchase small luxuries like tea and sugar. He shared his improved circumstances with Rafiki, whose diet now included commercial dog food purchased from the safari lodge, supplemented by the occasional gifts from the lionesses. Rafiki grew old gracefully. His muzzle turned gray, his movements slowed, but he remained healthy in the way that well-fed, protected animals remain healthy. He no longer ventured far from the shack, content to hold his small territory and receive visitors, both human and feline, rather than ranging across the savanna. The pride changed, as prides do. Cubs grew to adolescence, adolescents to adults. Some left to find their own territories or join other prides. Others stayed, forming the next generation of lions who would carry the memory of the dog who lived among them. The young male, no longer young, sired multiple generations of cubs, his genes spreading through the Conservancy's lion population. And through it all, the bond persisted. Not unchanged, it could not remain unchanged as individuals aged and died and were replaced, but continuous, passed down through behavior and memory, and the stories that animals tell each other through scent and sound and example. 4 years after Rafiki's return to the shack, the old lioness died. She passed peacefully, in her sleep, lying in the shade of the acacia tree that grew beside the shack, the same tree under which she had first brought Rafiki an impala carcass, the same tree that had sheltered so many of their interactions. Rafiki found her body in the morning and lay beside it, whimpering, until Kofi emerged and understood what had happened. The old man sat down next to them both, his hand resting on Rafiki's head, and cried. For the lioness, for the injured male whose death had started this, for all the losses that accumulated over a lifetime lived close to the wild. The pride came. They surrounded the old lioness's body and rumbled their grief, a deep sound that carried across the savanna and brought other animals to stillness, listening. They stayed through the night, guarding her body as she had guarded so many of theirs. And in the morning, they departed, leaving her to the earth. Kofi and Rafiki buried her, dug a grave at the base of the acacia tree and covered her with soil and stones, marking the spot with a cairn that would last. It was not traditional for lions, who usually abandoned their dead, but it felt necessary, this acknowledgement of how much she had mattered. After her death, the dynamics shifted again. The younger lionesses continued to visit, but less frequently, drawn by their own cubs and territories and the demands of survival. Rafiki was alone more often, dependent again on Kofi's care rather than the pride's provisioning. But he did not seem unhappy. He had lived more richly than any street dog could hope to live, had experienced bonds that transcended species, had been protected and valued and loved. When tourists asked Kofi if he was sad that the lions visited less often, he would shake his head and smile. The story is not ending, he would say. It is changing, growing. The cubs who played with Rafiki are adults now, teaching their own cubs. The memory spreads. Maybe in 50 years, there will be lions in this conservancy who remember, in whatever way lions remember, that once a dog was family. Rafiki lived to be 13 years old, ancient for a street dog, comfortable for a protected one. He died as the old lioness had died, peacefully, in his sleep, lying in his usual spot in the shade beside the shack. Kofi found him in the morning and sat beside his body for a long time. That evening, without being called, 3 lionesses appeared at the shack. They were the daughters of the lionesses who had first accepted Rafiki, the granddaughters of the old lioness who had fought for his protection. They settled around Rafiki's body and rumbled, not grief exactly, but acknowledgement, recognition that something significant had passed from the world. They stayed until dawn, then departed, and Kofi buried Rafiki next to the old lioness beneath the acacia tree that had sheltered them both. The story could have ended there, should have ended there by all logical expectations, but the wild is not governed by narrative convenience, and the bonds formed between Rafiki and the pride had woven themselves into the fabric of the ecosystem in ways that persisted beyond any individual life. 2 weeks after Rafiki's death, a puppy appeared at the shack. It was small, maybe 2 months old, a mixed breed like Rafiki had been, and it was starving. Kofi found it whimpering in the clearing, and, after a moment of shock, and something that might have been recognition of pattern, brought it inside, fed it, gave it water. That evening, the 3 lionesses returned. They investigated the puppy with their noses, rumbling softly, and one of them, the daughter of the lioness who had first brought food to Rafiki, left and returned an hour later with a small piece of meat from a recent kill. She placed it in the clearing, 10 meters from the shack, and backed away. The puppy, emboldened by youth and hunger, scrambled to the meat and began to eat. The lioness watched, her tail swishing, her expression, if lionesses could be said to have expressions, satisfied. Kofi watched from the doorway and began to laugh. It was a sound he had not made in years, a sound of pure joy and astonishment at the world's capacity for continuity and renewal. So, he said to the lioness, to the puppy, to the memory of Rafiki and the injured male and the old lioness, the story continues. The lioness rumbled in response, agreement perhaps, or simply acknowledgement that she had heard. The puppy, having eaten its fill, waddled back to the shack and pressed against Kofi's leg, seeking the warmth and safety that all young creatures seek. Kofi picked it up, cradling it against his chest, and looked out at the savannah as the sun set in spectacular oranges and reds. In the distance, a lion roared. The young male, old now himself, still marking territory, still leading what remained of his pride. And closer, from the acacia shadows, came an answering rumble. One of the lionesses, responding, maintaining the boundaries that had been established years before. Boundaries that protected not just territory, but relationships, not just pride, but memory. The wild had made space, however small, however temporary, for something unprecedented. And that space, once created, seemed determined to persist. Not because it made evolutionary sense, not because it improved survival odds, but because sometimes, for reasons that defy reductionist explanation, connections form that transcend the simple calculations of predator and prey, that speak to something deeper in the fabric of life itself. Kofi named the puppy Tumaini, hope in Swahili, and raised it as he had raised Rafiki, with care and patience and the understanding that he was not just raising a dog, but stewarding a relationship between species, maintaining a bridge that should not exist, but did. And the pride, in their way, accepted this. They visited Tumaini as they had visited Rafiki, brought meat where they could, protected the shack from threats, taught their cubs that this small patch of earth operated under different rules. The young male, in his old age, even visited once, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the puppy play with lion cubs, his expression unreadable, but his presence alone a form of acceptance. Years later, when biologists compiled their research on the pride, they noted something extraordinary. The behavioral modification that had begun with a single injured lion and a homeless dog had become inheritable. Not genetically, but culturally, passed down through learning and example from generation to generation. The pride had developed a tradition, a practice that defined them as unique among their species. They were the lions who protected dogs, who welcomed strange creatures into their social structure, who had learned somehow that the boundaries between predator and prey were more permeable than anyone had believed. The research papers used careful language, avoided anthropomorphism, stuck to observable behaviors and statistical analyses. But between the lines, anyone who read them could sense the wonder, the recognition that they were documenting something profound, proof that the wild, for all its cruelty and indifference, could also produce moments of grace, could forge bonds that should not exist, could hold space for the impossible. Kofi lived to be 91 years old. He spent his last years at the shack, caring for Tumani and then Tumani's successor, a steady stream of abandoned or orphaned dogs who found their way to the one place in the conservancy where dogs were not just tolerated but celebrated. He died peacefully, surrounded by the sounds he loved, dogs breathing in sleep, lions rumbling in the distance, the wind moving through acacia branches. The pride attended his funeral, all of them, even the old male, standing at the edges as humans wept and buried him next to Rafiki and the old lioness, beneath the tree that had sheltered so much love. And then they returned to the wild, as they must, carrying with them the memory of the man who had witnessed their transformation, who had documented their story, who had believed in the possibility of connection across impossible divides. The shack still stands. It's maintained now by the Conservancy as a research station and a memorial, a place where biologists and tourists can come to witness the pride's ongoing relationship with whatever dog currently lives there. The arrangement persists, generation after generation, a living testament to the day a lone dog saved a lion king and changed the rules of the wild forever. The acacia tree has grown tall, its branches providing shade in the brutal African sun. Beneath it, 3 graves, a lioness, a dog, and a man. 3 different species buried together, their stories intertwined, their legacy alive in every rumble of greeting, every shared kill, every moment when predator and prey choose connection over ancient hostility. The wild turns, the sun rises and sets, cubs are born, grow old, and die. But the memory persists, encoded not in genes but in behavior, not in instinct but in choice. The choice to honor debts, to preserve bonds, to believe that sometimes, rarely, impossibly, the rules can be rewritten. And in the evening, when the sky turns gold and the heat finally breaks, you can still see them, lions and dogs, resting together in the shade, living proof that the wild contains mysteries deeper than survival and bonds stronger than fear. Life continues, the story evolves, and somewhere in the African savanna, beneath an acacia tree, love between species endures.